Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Gibson, and I'm director of the Center on Religion and Culture here at Fordham University. And I want to thank you all for being here for our symposium marking the 35th anniversary of Cardinal Joseph Bernardin's famous Consistent Ethic of Life lecture delivered right here at Fordham. Now, the year was 1983, and the nation then was roiled by political divisions that had been heightened during Ronald Reagan's first term, and by intense anxieties about growing international tensions in the Cold War with the Soviet Union over nuclear weapons, tensions that were spilling out into merciless hot conflicts in many other regions around the world. It was, in many respects, an era much like our own, though from the perspective of the headlines these days, the 1980s can almost seem like an innocent time. Yet it's important to remember how fraught our society and our nation was back then, as well as our own Catholic Church. And to remember that Cardinal Bernardin stepped up to address those tensions and those fissures head on. And he did so at this Jesuit university. As Bernardin said in his opening remarks at that lecture, quote, "The setting of today's lecture has shaped its substance. The setting is a university, a community, and an institution committed to the examination and testing of ideas. More specifically, Fordham is an American Catholic university, an institution which has consistently fostered the work of enriching American culture through Catholic wisdom, and has simultaneously sought to enhance our understanding of Catholic faith by drawing on the American tradition. That continues to be our task today, our mission here at Fordham. And in that spirit, we are pleased and honored to begin this evening's symposium with a presentation from Bishop Gerald Kicanas, a Chicago native who worked with Bernardin before being named Bishop of Tucson in Arizona. In fact, he was complaining about the cold weather as he was coming in. And I said, how long it's been since you were in Chicago? He retired from that post a little over a year ago, though you'd hardly know it from the schedule he keeps. I got to take lessons from this guy. And lucky for us, perhaps it's his vegetarian diet, an aspect of the consistent ethic perhaps we can touch on later. Following Bishop Kicanas' address, we will then hear briefly from three respondents representing other faith and non-faith traditions with their views on the consistent ethic of life, and then I'll moderate a discussion among all our panelists. We will then field some of your questions. As usual, we would ask that you write your questions on the index cards on the seats or in front of your seats with the accompanying pencils. And our assistants will collect them. Please write succinctly and legibly. If I can't read them, I can't ask them. So please now join me in welcoming Bishop Gerald Kicanas.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dave, for the invitation to be here tonight. You know, I hold the highest regard for our Catholic universities. Some people question their Catholicity, but I am confident that they are places where true dialogue and true engagement about important issues take place. And I hope that will be true of our evening tonight, that we can engage, we can engage in some good discussion. We have a wonderful panel, Rabbi Jill and Katelyn and Herb, and we're ready to dialogue together with you. You know, Cardinal Joseph Bernardin was a transformative leader, a breakthrough leader, someone who shaped the times and provided a direction for the church through turbulent waters. You know, such a leader is not always welcomed, valued, or appreciated. Such a leader faces opposition and can even be shunned. We've experienced that again with the papacy of Francis. Yet such a leader courageously speaks and persistently, unhesitatingly raises his or her voice and refuses to be silenced. Such a leader humbly, with sensitivity, patience, prudence, and empathy, seeks to convince people of another way of thinking, relating, and living than that in which they are engaged currently. Cardinal Bernardine, as you may remember, was elected as chair of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Pro-Life Committee and was invited, as David mentioned, to give a 1983 Gannon lecture here at Fordham. Bernardine titled his presentation, "A Consistent Ethic of Life, an American Catholic Dialogue." This provocative talk connected issues of poverty, euthanasia, nuclear war, abortion, and other life issues into one ethic of life. The presentation ushered in a new way of viewing moral living, which emphasized the protection of the unborn, the care of the poor, the elderly, and the environment as interrelated and intertwined. This kind of out-of-the-box thinking is just what was needed to move beyond the impasse that had formed within the church and in society around life issues. Some ignored the unborn, focusing their passion for those on the margins. Others upheld the right to life of the unborn without any consideration for the degradation of human life found in the plight of the poor, and even less for the care of creation. Bernardine, you see, asked himself an important question. How can we bring warring factions within the church who feel passionately about one or another life issue to come together in support and defense of everything that upholds life and its God-given dignity? His answer, of course, was the consistent ethic at every stage and in every circumstance. Stephen Millies, I don't know if Steve is here. There he is. Good to see you, Steve. Director of the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union, notes in his book, and get a copy of it, Good Intentions, and I quote him, "Bernardine offered no fewer than 10 public lectures exploring and deepening the theme of the consistent ethic of life between 1983 and 1986, and then later even more. More extraordinary, he participated in an academic symposium on the consistent ethic. Bernardine sat while scholars probed, questioned, and refined the consistent ethic, and then he published their findings. In this anniversary reflection tonight, I want to consider first Bernardine as a leader for his time. Second, how breakthrough ideas are often treated with resistance. And finally, how this leader's breakthrough idea has taken on new life and new vigor in the words and actions in the papacy of Pope Francis. First, a leader with vision. Joseph Bernardine was an authentic leader. He lived what he said. He pursued his goals despite distractions and setbacks. He possessed willpower, maintaining focus amid turbulence. This can be seen in his single-minded effort spearheading to completion the Peace Pastoral Challenge of Peace in 1983. Frank Maniscalco is here, and Frank was certainly there at that time. And that of the economy, the economic justice for all in 1986, despite the resistance of some. He was able to forge common ground by his attention on what mattered to others and respecting others' insights and opinions different than his own. He was a masterful diplomat who understood others' feelings and respected those feelings. He knew what mattered to you. He understood what you needed. He was able at times not to be in control. He could focus his attention on you. I experienced that the first time I met Joseph. I was principal of a seminary day high school of 750 boys. Believe it or not, when Bernardine first visited the school after arriving in Chicago, he insisted on meeting each of those 750 boys. They lined up by years, and he greeted each student. His attention focused on each one, even if just for a few seconds. It was as if he had all the time in the world to be with you. That was characteristic of the man. He wanted to know you and what was important to you. That is an essential quality, I believe, of a leader. In this age of distracted attention, with people frequently glancing at cell phones or checking emails, I'm watching to see which of you are doing that, looking to see who is trying to reach them, as if that is the most important thing in the world. Such focused attention is rare, yet critically important. Bernardine, you see, was able to put ideas together in novel ways and could ask the right questions that could break through divisions and open a path through to a solution. Perhaps the greatest test of his courage as a leader happened when Bernardine was accused of sexual misconduct with a minor. You may remember that. His name on the headline of every newspaper. I was rector at the University of St. Mary of the Lake, the major seminary in the Archdiocese of Chicago at that time. I remember getting a call from the cardinal late at night the next day after the news broke. He said, "Jerry, I wonder, I'm worried about what the seminarians might be thinking, what's going on in their minds, maybe what their questions are. Do you think I could come out and perhaps talk and answer their questions? Jerry, what do you think?" I said, "Sure, Your Eminence, please come." Well, sure enough, he did come several days later. All 120 seminarians were gathered in a room unlike this room, an upper lecture hall on the second floor of the studies building. When the cardinal and I came into the room, everyone got quiet. Nobody said a word. After a brief comment by the cardinal, he paused and asked, "Do you have any questions?" Well, no one said a word. You could cut the silence with a knife. Finally, one of the seminarians tentatively raised his hand and meekly asked, "Your Eminence, what has it been like?" Well, the cardinal paused for the longest time, and finally he said, "I was embarrassed, totally embarrassed, totally. Here I am, the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, accused of sexual misconduct with a minor, my name on the headline of every newspaper around the world, even in my hometown in Italy, for my family to see. I went home that night," he said, "all by myself. I walked up the darkened staircase of the house to the second floor where my room is. I entered the room surrounded by all the honorary degrees and recognitions I had received from all over the world. And I prostrated myself on the floor," he said, "as if I were naked. But do you know," he said, "I experienced a closeness to God at that moment than I had ever experienced before." Bernardine courageously faced opposition, hostility, and criticism. But that allegation drew out of him a true profile of courage. He met with his accuser, who had admitted that he falsely accused him, and the cardinal prayed with him. The consistent ethic notion presented by Cardinal Bernardin was an extraordinarily innovative idea. It sought to put behind the narrow, competing notion of the Church's social justice tradition to discover its interconnectedness. Life issues and justice issues were intertwined. The notion came from a man who sought harmony, not discord. It was put forward by a true leader with vision. Breakthrough ideas, as we all know, often encounter resistance. The consistent ethic insight of Bernardin has been resisted from the time it was first presented here at Fordham. Critics contend the notion makes all moral issues equivalent on the same plane. Some saw this approach as too accommodating at a time when the Church needed to be more aggressive in confronting a secular society that had forgotten and dismissed the rights of the unborn. Bernardin, they thought, was watering down the Church's clear teaching by linking life and social issues in a consistent ethic. The separation of the broad range of life issues has resulted, as we all know, in a red-blue world where affiliation with one's political party trumps one's faith. The camps have been formed, and allegiance to one camp in opposition to the other is expected, even required in our day. Party allegiance becomes the frame by which truth is determined. We see that in the media that presents truth from the perspective of the party with which one is aligned. We saw this on display most vividly in the contentious hearings and divided confirmation of the latest Supreme Court nominee. Roe versus Wade became the lightning rod for whether one was for or against the nominee and how one evaluated the charge of sexual misconduct brought against him. The rich, comprehensive social teaching of the Church has been blemished by the cherry-picking approach of too many today. Bishop Robert McElroy, in the Bernardin address given on April 18, 2018 at Loyola University in Chicago, said, and I quote, "A truly Catholic political imagination would break through these barriers in the clear conviction that the compassion of a disciple of Jesus Christ cannot be compartmentalized. It finds expression in the face of every form of human suffering." Cardinal Blaise Cupich, in his inaugural Cardinal Bernardin Common Cause address at Loyola in Chicago, said, quotes, "Without oversimplifying, the challenge for us today is not only that the issues are in silos, separated one from another, it is also that people in their social networks and through the media they consult are in silos, bereft of challenge or debate, isolated by differences of opinion or politics, race or social justice, in a way that obscures our shared humanity and the ties that historically have united us as a nation of immigrants." Let's look at the era of Pope Francis. It should be clear that what Cardinal Bernardin identified as a consistent ethic of life at every stage and in every circumstance has been ripening in the life of the Church over the years since he gave this address here at Fordham. Great ideas take time to mature, sometimes endless time to mature, to take hold, to work their way into our thinking and acting. The basic direction, although not the precise wording, became a part of the magisterium of Pope St. John Paul II, especially in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae. In that teaching, for example, he established
a day set aside for prayer and reflection on life. In the course of engaging in this prayer, he threads together the various life issues and the various communities of concern, as he wrote. In view of this, and following the suggestion made by the cardinals in the consistory of 1991, I propose a day for life be celebrated each year in every country, as already established by some Episcopal conferences. The celebration of this day should be planned and carried out with the active participation of all sectors of the local church. Its primary purpose should be to foster in individual consciences and families, in the church and in civil society, a recognition of the meaning and value of human life at every stage and in every condition. Particular attention should be drawn to the seriousness of abortion and euthanasia without neglecting other aspects of life which from time to time deserve to be given careful consideration as occasion and circumstances demand. There has been a consistency and continuity of magisterial teaching on the interrelatedness of the life issues from John Paul to Benedict to Francis. Clearly, the seminal insight of Bernardine on the consistent ethic has seen heightened emphasis, especially in the writings of Francis. But even more, it has become personified in the very person of the Pope. Although the intellectual underpinnings of the two men differ greatly, they have come to the same understanding of life issues as intertwined. If there is a particular development in this area in Pope Francis that calls for our attention, it seems to me that it has to do with formation to live out this consistent ethic. Realities, the Pope often says, are greater than ideas. It is not just a matter of having the right or correct conception. We must be able to put these things into action. As Jesuit superior, Pope Francis encouraged seminarians to take 3 steps. First, to humble oneself and enter into direct contact with those in need. Second, to carry out concrete works of mercy. And third, to become more aware of poverty in society and to reform unjust structures. From the beginning of his papacy, he has envisioned the call for a poor church in touch with the poor. He makes visible this teaching by his caress of a child with disability, by his washing the feet of prisoners, by his attention to the migrant and refugee, by his plea for Mother Earth. Francis is a master of the symbolic, showing without words his compassion and care for those on the margins, for those whose lives seem not to matter. I remember after Cardinal Bernardine was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he spent time holding healing services around the archdiocese for those who were sick. One time in an open-air mass near St. Agatha Parish in Lawndale, Bernardine was celebrating Mass. After communion, as he sat down for a moment of silence, an African-American woman, quite disheveled, came up from the back by the center aisle. Some tried to stop her, but Bernardine saw her and told them to let her come forward onto the platform on which the altar was placed. He stood, and they talked for a while as everyone looked on, and then he blessed her. Bernardine, in his illness, learned to have time for everyone, especially those who seemed to count for nothing. Both men, Francis and Bernardine, make visible the care of the littlest and weakest, be that the unborn, the homeless, the victim of child abuse, or the desperate poor. As Bernardine wrote in an address to Amnesty International at Loyola University on June 23rd of 1984, and I quote, "To lay violent hands on the person is to come as close as can be to laying violent hands on God." The person, then, is the key to the entire social presence and outreach of the church. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis says, among the vulnerable for whom the church wishes to care with particular love and concern are unborn children, the most defenseless and innocent among us. Nowadays, efforts are made, he says, to deny them their human dignity and to do with them whatever one pleases, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this. Frequently, as a way of ridiculing the church's effort to defend their lives, attempts are made to present her position as ideological, obscurantist, and conservative. Yet this defense of unborn life, Francis says, is closely linked to the defense of each and every other human right. It involves the conviction that a human being is always sacred and inviolable in any situation and at every stage of development. Human beings are ends in themselves and never a means of resolving other problems. Once this conviction disappears, Francis says, so do solid and lasting foundations for the defense of human rights, which would always be subject to the passing whims of the powers that be. This is not something subject to alleged reforms or modernizations. It is not, quotes, progressive to try to resolve problems by eliminating a human life. More recently, in Gaudete et Exultate, Pope Francis makes clear the interrelatedness of the life issues when he says, our defense of the innocent unborn, for example, needs to be clear, firm, and passionate, for at stake is the dignity of human life, which is always sacred and demands love for each person, regardless of his or her stage of development. Equally sacred, however, are the lives of the poor, those already born, the destitute, the abandoned, and the underprivileged, the vulnerable, infirm, and elderly exposed to covert euthanasia, the victims of human trafficking, new forms of slavery, and every form of rejection. We cannot uphold an ideal of holiness that would ignore injustice in a world where some revel, spend with abandon, and live only for the latest consumer goods, even as others look on from afar, living their entire lives in abject poverty. Austin Ivory, in his biography of Pope Francis, says, he will not compromise on the hot-button issues that divide the church from the secular West, a gap liberals would like to close by modernizing doctrine. Yet, he is also just as obviously not a pope for the Catholic right. He will not use the papacy to fight political and cultural battles he believes should be fought at the diocesan level, but to attract and teach. Nor does he feel the need endlessly to repeat what is already well known, but wants to stress what has been obscured. God's loving kindness and forgiving mercy. That's what is central. And where Catholic conservatives would like him to speak more about morality than social issues, Francis is happy to do quite the opposite, to rescue Catholicism as a seamless garment, says Ivory. So Francis, like Bernardine, has spoken forcibly about the evil of abortion, but he has also spoken clearly about issues that pro-life Catholics do not put on the forefront of their advocacy, the environment and capital punishment. In Laudato Si, Francis, like his predecessors, Pope St. John Paul II, who spoke of the need for ecological conversion, and Benedict XVI, who was dubbed, quotes, the Green Pope, reminds us that we have a responsibility to care for Mother Earth. He asks, what kind of world do we want to give our children? For Pope Francis, care of human beings is connected to the care of creation. Pope Francis uses very blunt language decrying the exploitation of the earth and exploiting people. Francis says, quote, "The earth is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us." The cry of the earth relates to the cry of the poor. There is an intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. Everything in the world is connected. For Francis, climate change affects entire populations, especially the poor living in poor countries, and is the cause of migrant movements. Many deny that, of course. But for Francis, the theology of dominion gives way to the theology of care and harmony. Francis challenges a throwaway culture that places priority on my needs, my interests, in the expense of our environment and other human beings. The earth is a gift, not a possession given to us to administer and not to destroy. Francis, in this document, places the caring stewardship of creation at the heart of the Catholic Church's moral purpose. A reduction of human consumption and the embrace of a life of simplicity are needed so that resources are preserved for future generations and the poor. For Pope Francis, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and one social, but one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis calls for dialogue and action. The Pope calls upon nations to talk together to reach global consensus and not to be hesitant to engage one another, even with those with whom we do not agree. Clearly, Bernardine sought such common ground through dialogue. Francis states that, quotes, "If humanity loses its compass, if we lose sight of the great motivations which make it possible for us to live in harmony, to make sacrifices, and to treat each other well, we will be powerless to solve the serious problems of the world." Recently, Pope Francis made clear that capital punishment, the taking of human life, is always inadmissible, and directed that the words in the Catechism of the Catholic Church be changed to reflect that teaching. As now written, the Catechism says, recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes, and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. There is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged, he says, of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. It is for this reason, and in the light of the gospel, that the Church teaches that this practice is inadmissible. This change caused a stir among some who see capital punishment as not among the non-negotiables that are never permitted. As good teachers and shepherds, Bernardine, like Francis, encourages dialogue and discussion, especially where people disagree or do not accept the teaching, as has been seen on the Church's teaching on the care of the environment and capital punishment. During the synods over which Francis has presided, he has encouraged the participants to say what is on their mind, and most of all, to listen. Francis's style reflects that of Christ in the Gospel of John, who held dialogues with Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman. Nicodemus, as you know, came to Christ while Jesus engaged the Samaritan woman. The dialogues proceeded slowly, marked by misunderstanding that was only gradually clarified. The dialogue was a learning moment, a moment of conversion. Both Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman left the dialogue changed. They felt listened to, challenged, and taught not by a one-way announcement, but by mutual dialogue. Pope Benedict XVI, in a May of 2010 address in Belém, Lisbon, Portugal, said, and I quote, "The Church must enter into dialogue with the world in which she lives. The Church becomes word, she becomes message, she becomes dialogue. Dialogue without ambiguity and marked by respect for those taking part is a priority in the world, and the Church does not intend to withdraw from it." Bernardine saw as the goal of this dialogue arriving at common ground, not meaning coming to a weak middle ground, a milquetoast center, but finding harmony between diverse positions that at first might seem opposed. Through dialogue, we come to discover the unity amid diversity and the diversity amid unity. This Pope Francis saw as the work of the Spirit, whom the fathers of the Church called ipse harmonia est. Clearly, for Francis, mercy and truth are not opposed to one another, as some today would like to propose, criticizing Francis for emphasizing mercy over truth, which clearly neither he nor Bernardine sought to do. Stephen Miles notes that dialogue was the goal of Pope Francis's synodality as much as it had been the goal when Cardinal Joseph Bernardine unveiled the Catholic Common Ground Initiative in 1996. Bernardine had seen the culture wars unfolding in the Church and in the United States. Wars, I might add, that still continue. When he wrote in 1996 about how we need to see dialogue, not just as a way to dampen conflict, but as a way to make our conflicts constructive, and ultimately as a way to understand for ourselves and articulate for our world the meaning of discipleship of Jesus Christ. In this sense, dialogue is something entirely different from an argument or a debate. The goal of a debate or an argument is to hold fast to an idea, to prove that it is true. When we recall the argument over cultural or group identity, we can see that people who adhere to a closed identity will be inclined to argue or debate. They believe that they possess the answer to an important question. For members of their group, that answer holds authority, and it must be defended at all cost. We heard that when Boston's Cardinal Bernard Law replied to the Common Ground Initiative, dialogue as a way to mediate between truth and dissent is mutual deception. Miles continues, while the goal of a debate or an argument is winning, the goal of dialogue is truth. It misunderstands dialogue entirely to think about it as a process of bargaining or negotiating, whittling away at the truth until there is so little left on which two parties can agree. Dialogue is the opposite, he says. Real dialogue requires two parties to abandon the confidence that they are completely right and to enter a conversation whose goal is to learn from one another's experiences until both recognize some truth in their discussion. Inevitably, both sides will yield some ground. 35 years after the Fordham lecture, we remain a very divided, polarized society as well as a church. We have yet to grasp the notion of the consistent ethic at every stage and in every circumstance. which draws us to see a moral dimension to all issues that jeopardize human life. As Cardinal Bernardine was misunderstood, so is Pope Francis. Massimo Borghese, in his outstanding book, The Mind of Pope Francis, encourages people to come to a better understanding of the Pope's intellectual and pastoral biography. His papacy is grounded in that intellectual and pastoral biography of the man. While some see a lack of continuity in the teaching of Francis, Rodrigo Guerra Lopez, in a presentation at Sacred Heart School of Theology, reminds us, quote, "The present-day magisterium must be interpreted in the light of the preceding magisterium. However, the preceding magisterium can also receive light from the present one." As we celebrate the anniversary of Bernardine's lecture here at Fordham, we can be confident his words were not spoken in vain. They continue to impact the church. You most likely have heard of Chicken Little. You know, old Chicken Little was afraid that the sky was falling, and he was running around, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling." And he ran outside, and he threw himself on his back, and he put his little feet up in the air, and a policeman was walking by. And he looked at him and said, "Chicken Little, what are you doing? The sky is going to fall, the sky is going to fall." And the policeman looked at him and said, "And you think you're going to hold up the sky with those two little feet?" And Chicken Little responded, "You do what you can. You do what you can." Well, Pope Francis and Cardinal Bernardine have their little feet up, holding up the sky. And some might say they're fools, but you do what you can. You do what you can. Thank you. Best part.
The best part, yes. Get yourself a glass of water. I think it's water, I believe. Yes. And our other invited guests can make their way up as well. Herb, you sure? Okay. As they make their way up, I'll just introduce them briefly. We have, well, our first respondent will be Katelyn Beaty, an evangelical Protestant, author and founding editor of the online magazine Hermeneutics. Get it? Hermeneutics. Now, Katelyn's a new New Yorker. She just moved here from where? From the Midwest?
Chicago.
Chicago, yes. As you can see, there's a subtle theme here. We bring everybody from Chicago to New York. You see what happened to the Steinfelds. Katelyn is a writer whose work I've followed for many years, and we're very glad she's here tonight and in New York for the foreseeable future. We're a very friendly crowd. We also have Rabbi Jill Jacobs, Executive Director of Tiruah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, a nationwide gathering of some 2,000 rabbis, I believe, engaged in social justice work. And she's certainly one of the most powerful voices advocating for social justice and ethical living. And finally, we have Herb Geraghty, Director of Communications for Rehumanize International, which brings together people of all faiths and backgrounds to advocate for a consistent ethic approach to life. Herb's passion for this cause is such that she came despite suffering a household accident, tore open her foot at home this weekend. She's blaming her dog, though, so I guess that's part of it. In his 1983 address, Cardinal Bernardine noted that, quote, "The substance of a Catholic position on a consistent ethic of life is rooted in a religious vision. But," he added, "the citizenry of the United States is radically pluralistic in moral and religious conviction." He wanted to engage that, and we do here this evening as well. So each of our respondents will speak for a few minutes about their take on the consistent ethic idea, and then we'll open up the discussion. First, Katelyn.
All right. Well, Thank you so much to all of you for being here tonight. I know you had plenty of holiday parties that you could have been at instead, so we're honored that you spent the evening with us, and I'm grateful for Bishop Kicanas' very thoughtful opening remarks, and it's given me a lot to chew on, and I look forward to hearing what Jill and Herb have to say in response as well. I'm responding to the provocative remarks we just heard as someone who has identified as an evangelical for most of my life. I had a classic conversion experience at age 18. I committed my life to Jesus in front of my youth group friends at a United Methodist church in Ohio, which is where I'm from. After studying at a college named after the Protestant reformer John Calvin, you might have heard of him, I would go on to serve as managing editor of Christianity Today magazine, and this is considered the flagship magazine of evangelicalism founded by the evangelist Billy Graham in the mid-20th century. And despite the uniquely bad rap the evangelical label has earned, maybe rightly so, since our last presidential election, it is a label that I continue to claim, even though many days it doesn't claim me back. But we're just in this awkward relationship, ongoing relationship. Today, I do remain hopeful that the evangelical movement can recover its arguably compromised moral witness in the public square. And I think one way to do this is precisely by seeking this consistent defense of life reflected in Bernardine's vision articulated on this campus 35 years ago. A 2006 statement from the ecumenical group Evangelicals and Catholics Together called both religious communities to renew their commitment to a culture of life. And that statement was titled, "That They May Have Life." And I wanted to highlight 4 commitments of that statement that I think pertain to our conversation tonight. That statement affirmed, quote, that every human life is intended by God from eternity for eternity. That the Bible's message of life is addressed universally, beyond the human race, even to the whole creation. That the Christian love thy neighbor ethic begins with respect for the neighbor's right to be, by honoring the gift of God that is the neighbor's life. And finally, that Christianity from its earliest days was a way of life that contrasted with the pagan culture's way of death. We see that in the earliest church's witness to life. I am afraid, however, that in evangelicals, partisan alignment, political alignment, and susceptibility to political manipulation over the past 40 years, that we evangelicals have often given ourselves over to a way of death, even while we are trying to pursue a way of life. In an attempt to address the tragedy of abortion via legal restrictions and Supreme Court appointments, evangelicals have ended up identifying with a political vision that often blames the poor for their own struggle, that shrugs at the alarming rates of gun violence that we see in this country, and that degrades the environment with little concern for generations to come. Very recently, evangelicals found themselves in an awkward position, to say the least, when they came to be identified with a political administration that separated children from their families at the US-Mexico border. Pope Francis says that family is the cradle of life. And so how could evangelicals in large part stand behind leaders who enact policies that rip vulnerable children from this precious cradle of life? To be sure, 35 years after Bernardine articulated the consistent life ethic, there do remain questions about how to enact this ethic within the confines of our two-party system. And further, I would say there is a serious argument to be made that unborn children deserve unique protections given their unique vulnerability. I am in some sense sympathetic to the charge that if we label pro-life, that if the label pro-life comes to mean any and all life, then the pro-life movement, what we've come to know that as over the last 40 years, could lose its strategic focus. We don't expect the gun control movement to add environmental degradation and euthanasia and elderly abuse to its list of concerns. There should be concentrated efforts to speak up for the dignity of the unborn and to ensure that no woman has to choose abortion out of economic strain or lack of communal support. That said, the call to a consistent life ethic remains both prophetic and urgent for showing how life is connected, that how a society treats the poor, the migrant, the abused, and the creation itself is ultimately tied up with the fate of every unborn child. The beauty of Bernardine's vision is not that it gives Christians a chance to appear conservative on certain issues and progressive on others. That would be capitulating to sort of worldly and, I think, largely unhelpful political categories. Rather, the beauty of this vision is to reveal how each person's flourishing is connected with every person's flourishing, and that each person's degradation is also our own degradation. As Bishop Kicanas said, everything in the world is connected, and that's what I find to be so beautiful about the consistent life ethic. I believe this ethic could greatly revitalize evangelicals' witness in the public square in the 21st century. It could set, I use the language of us, so this is my family I'm talking to. It could set us free from simplistic binaries and the way we have made political expediency an idol. It could give us courage to hold our politicians accountable, especially political leaders who claim to be pro-life when a lot in their conduct and their character and their policies lead to death. A consistent life ethic would ultimately restore evangelicals to their namesake. Evangelical, after all, means good news people. And so may evangelicals, these good news people, take this vision from their Catholic brothers and sisters and learn to live deeply into it in both mercy and truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Katelyn. Jill?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you to David for organizing this gathering, and to Bishop Kicanas, and to Katelyn, and to Herb. It's really wonderful to be here and to be part of this conversation. There's much in the idea of a consistent ethic of life that echoes for me as a Jew and as a rabbi, and then there's also some serious differences, which I will also talk about. First, I want to talk a little bit about the framing. In the beginning of what we call the Torah, you call the Bible, of course, the very first thing that we learn about human beings is that all of us are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And that's a powerful idea that tells us, first of all, that any injury to a human being is an injury to God. This is an idea that the later rabbis in the Talmud and other ancient texts develop, and suggests that, in fact, any time a human being is killed or injured, that God's presence is diminished in the world. So that's very serious. If you are in a position that you might hurt another human being, you better think about that. It resonated. Actually, the quote that you offered, that laying violent hands on a person is like laying violent hands on God. So the same idea is there. And the idea of human beings as created in the image of God also imposes certain obligations on us, because, of course, in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, the main thing that we know about God is that God is a creator. And human beings also have that power both of creation and also of stewardship. We're told right away that we're supposed to steward the earth. Until that point, there hasn't been any hierarchy. It's not like the animals are told that they have to take care of the plants. It's only human beings who are told that we have responsibilities as human beings toward the world around us, and certainly also toward other human beings. The fact that, according to the Bible, only one human being is created at the beginning, we can talk for a long time about the different creation stories and the details, but basically that one human being is created, including male and female, teaches us that every single human being is equally a creation in the image of God. In fact, the Talmud teaches us that the reason that God created one human being is that nobody can say, well, my grandparents were greater than your grandparents. So we have this idea that human beings are created equally, uniquely in the image of God, and also that imposes certain responsibilities on us. Within the later Jewish legal tradition, that is developed through an attempt to try to figure out how it is that we can create a world that is the most just for the most people. And there's lots and lots of details about how we create a criminal justice system that is fair both for perpetrators and for victims. How do we create a system of work that is just for both employers and employees, et cetera, with many, many details and thousands of pages, but all based on this question of how do we make sure that everybody in the world, no matter what our station in life, no matter what the particular circumstances of our birth, of our life are, how do we make sure that each of us is afforded the dignity due to a creation in the image of God? So there are many, many details on that. When we think, for example, about some of the issues that you raised, particularly in relationship to Pope Francis's focus on immigrants, on prisoners, or on those who are at the margins of society, something that is crucial in the Jewish tradition is that when we talk about issues of the creation in the image of God, how we treat others, very often the examples have to do with those whom we might want to write off. So the person who is coming looking for money, the person who is the most desperately poor. One of the most famous passages in the Talmud, actually the one I referenced before, where it says that everybody is created, that God created one person to begin with, comes in the context of a passage that talks about how we make sure that we grill the witnesses in capital cases to make sure that we don't execute anybody who is innocent, and I'll talk about that more in a second. So the real questions about how we create a society where there's the most dignity for the most people almost always come in the context of talking about those who are most vulnerable. In terms of capital punishment in particular, we know, of course, that the Bible lays out capital punishment as a punishment, and the rabbis of the Talmud really grapple with that because they don't like it, and they're very aware of the inherent contradiction, the idea that the punishment for murdering another person is that you yourself are killed. Right? That's very clear according to the literal meaning of the biblical text. Luckily, we're not biblical literalists, so they can develop it in many ways. But the inherent paradox is, if we've said that the loss of any human being means that God's own presence is diminished, then why would you respond to the loss of one person by losing another person? So there's an inherent contradiction, and also they're extremely worried that you might execute somebody who was innocent, which we know from our society unfortunately happens too often. And so the rabbis institute a whole series of requirements that effectively legislate away capital punishments. They never exactly say capital punishment is illegal, but they say in order to carry it out, you have to have two witnesses, two eyewitnesses who are unrelated to each other and unrelated to the perpetrator or the victim, and they have to be looking from the same vantage point. So if they're looking out of windows on opposite sides of the street, it doesn't count. And they have to give a warning ahead of time, meaning they have to say to the person, you know that if you do this act, particularly of murder, that the punishment is capital punishment, and the person has to say, yes, I know, and then carry it out. They're asked all sorts of questions. Very famously, one rabbi liked to ask about the stalks of the fig trees, what color they were. So imagine you've just witnessed a murder, and you're being interrogated to see whether you're a reliable witness, and the person says, so the fig trees, the stalks, were they brown or green? I don't know. I was watching the murder, right? So effectively, they legislated out of existence, even eventually saying that a court that ever carries out capital punishment is a murderous court. So they're very clever at being able to maintain the literal meaning of the biblical words while making sure that they're never able to be carried out. The one place where there is an obvious difference is around abortion, because in Judaism, life begins at birth, not at conception. So that is just a very clear difference. And the belief that life begins at birth for us means that abortion is certainly allowed when there's a question of the life of the mother. In the speech by Cardinal Bernardine, he uses language that I think, I'm not sure, maybe you can tell me, is probably a response to Jewish beliefs, where he says the fetus is not an aggressor. So in Judaism, we do talk about the fetus in a case where the woman's life is in danger. The fetus is considered a rodef, which is a pursuer, and one who can be, so that you can do an abortion to preserve the life of the mother. There's a lot of complicated law about exactly what status the fetus has when and whether it's considered just a part of the woman's body, when it becomes something else, not quite a life, but something maybe in between. Questions, in general, there's permission for abortion when there is a medical condition that would be inconsistent with life if this fetus were to be born, but there's much discussion about when and whether. So it's not just a cut or dry, but certainly the basic idea that life begins at birth gives rise to many different approaches to abortion than certainly are within Catholicism or other forms of Christianity. But what I think is the more important point is that when we think about what are considered religious issues in this country, usually people, if you walk up to a random person on the street and say, what's a religious issue? They will most likely say abortion and LGBT issues. Those are the ones that have been framed as religious issues. And the idea of the consistent ethic of life gives us permission or inspires us to think much more broadly about what kind of a world we want to create for everybody who lives in this world. And we can then argue about the details, but the idea of committing to making sure that everyone in this world is treated like a creation in the image of God gives us a much broader framing, a much broader sense of morality, and a much broader way to talk about what it means to be a religious person than just to focus on the narrow issues, which are in particular the issues that divide many of us. And so I think I really appreciate the opportunity to enter into this conversation through a broad framing that allows for much more conversation rather than begin with the issues where we disagree. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here among these panelists and the bishop. So, as David mentioned, I am Herb. I work with Rehumanize International. We are a nonprofit human rights organization that is dedicated to advancing and promoting the consistent life ethic. So as happens at a lot of pro-life or consistent life ethic events, I am the token atheist here. Raise your hand if anyone here is a non-believer. Non-believer atheist. Okay, we have like several. That's pretty good. There's dozens of us in the world. And so I think that it's always kind of a weird place for me to be in, and I'm always really excited to be there. A story I like to share sometimes is one time when I was the president of the pro-life club at my college, I was at an event. It was a mixer for the different Christian groups on campus, and I was just, promoting my pro-life club. And there was a priest there, and he was asking me about my club, and we were talking about it. And I guess he didn't recognize me from Mass, so he said, "Oh, what denomination are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm an atheist." And he said, after knowing I was the president of the pro-life club, "Oh, that's great," which is not the response a priest should have to someone not believing in Jesus. But I think that there is this idea that every pro-life person or every person with a consistent life ethic is a Catholic. And I appreciate that this event is framed by having people of different faith backgrounds here to talk about it, because I don't think that happens a lot. And the media really does not highlight the voices that are pro-life or consistent life ethic that are not, Catholic priests or bishops. So a question that I get asked quite a bit is, why do I hold the philosophy that I do if I don't believe in God? And I always think this is a little bit funny because to me, the consistent life ethic is incredibly baseline. It's don't kill human beings, don't torture people, people deserve food, water, shelter. This is something that I think everyone should believe, and I don't think you need a higher power to tell you that. But I do understand that atheism versus Christianity or some other theistic religion are radically different worldviews, and I can get into discussions about exactly why I believe in a moral philosophy, and I can cite, my philosophy courses from college and lay out a pretty convincing argument using Kantian categorical imperatives and, higher order capacity for moral thinking to lay out why I think you can believe in human rights without believing in a God. But I don't think that's how most people think, religious or non-religious. I think that we all sort of, regardless of where it comes from, have an understanding of human rights in some way. And I think that's what the consistent life ethic is and what it should be and how it should be presented. Because it really is an incredibly accessible philosophy. It's a philosophy, It's a philosophy that I think can be accepted by people of radically different worldviews. And I think that's what's quite beautiful about it. I think that the word consistent in the consistent life ethic is very apt and very important within our modern political paradigm. I'm sure many of us have seen, or perhaps if you're involved in pro-life apologetics, have been screamed at that you can't really call yourself pro-life if you believe in war or support Trump or support family separation at the border. And of course, when I hear that, my response is always, okay, well, I don't, but can we still talk about abortion? And it's sort of offensive, like, well, no, I don't believe in the death penalty, so am I allowed to call myself pro-life? But I do understand the accusation after decades of the right to life movement being linked inextricably to the Republican Party that is linked to these anti-life policies. And of course, a pro-lifer stance on any of those other issues doesn't negate the fact that abortion, in my view, and we can talk about this among the panelists, is wrong and is killing a human being and should absolutely be illegal. But it does beg the question of why believe in the right to life for the preborn, but not for all of those other people who your politics are sort of throwing under the bus sometimes. Now, this question can also be asked to the other side. How can you claim to stand for peace or equality while supporting the discriminatory violence of legal abortion? No one's really in the clear here, and that's what I really like about the consistent life ethic, because it challenges everyone, but it does so in a way that I think can call people in instead of out. So as much as it might feel good to type on Facebook that, you're not really pro-life if you support Trump or support X policy, or, you're not a feminist because you support abortion and it kills 1 million girls every year. Those things might feel good, but they're not, I think, in a true spirit of actually conveying this philosophy, which does respect human rights. And I think that respecting the people who we're trying to protect within the consistent life ethic, the poor, the unborn, the disabled, the ill, the elderly, that needs to extend to our political opposition. And I think that the way that we do that, for me and with the work that Rehumanize International does, is starting with rehumanizing the people who disagree with you and rehumanizing the people who dehumanize. And I think that that is where we have to start and where we have to rehumanize ourselves, realize our humanity before we can go out and try to convince anyone that anyone else's life matters if we're not respecting our own lives and the lives of the people we're talking to about these issues. So I'm really excited to get to the Q&A. Kind of mad that I'm last because now I want to speed through and just get to it. So let's do that. Let's get to it.
Thank you, Herb, and let's do it. Let's get right to the nub of things. Jill, I love you called out some of the differences, fundamental differences on Obviously, abortion is a big one, death penalty. Others could talk about euthanasia. And Jerry, abortion remains so front and center to the Catholic moral imagination. And we're all talking, in very positive terms, and Herb put it so well, about this consistent ethic. But there are these big things that even us on the panel disagree with. How does this work? Is a consistent ethic anything except, on the ground, does it work in terms of action, in terms of, as you said, Jerry, living out, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk? Can the consistent ethic really be a basis for this kind of dialogue on such passionate issues?
Yeah, I think.
I think you have to lift that one. Yeah. Is that on?
I think the key, obviously, is dialogue and engaging the other who may see things differently than you do. I think the assumption is people think, act, and feel the way I do. The reality is people think, act, and feel differently than I do. And therefore, how do I engage in a dialogue that helps me and them to understand how we do differ and why we do differ, and to try and work through that in an engaging way. Right now, I think dialogue is not well respected in our society. We talk at each other. We listen, as I said in the presentation, to those we think we agree with and dismiss those that we don't agree with. And that is a dynamic that I think leads to division, it leads to polarity, and it's not a helpful methodology. And we see that politically, and sometimes we see it in the church as well. So I think the way through is, as Jill mentioned, for example, in Tucson, we have a beautiful relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish community. We stand arm in arm on issues of refugees and migrants. We stand arm in arm at the border, but we disagree on this issue of where life begins. Obviously, as a church, we take the very conservative position that life begins at conception. But, that's obviously a debatable issue in society. Where does life really begin? Thomas Aquinas didn't see it as beginning at conception. So it's a challenge, I think, but I think the engagement has to be in some kind of dialogue. I don't know what others.
Jill, can you engage with that? Can you work?
Well, I think the issues on which we disagree are pretty limited, actually. And as I said, and so you just said, abortion is the major one. And that's a place that we're probably not going to come to agreement because it's based on a fundamental belief. It's not about logic. It's that, for me, I believe that life begins at birth. For those who believe that life begins at conception, we just start at different points, and where we come to from that makes complete logical sense because of where we started. But we're not going to agree on where we started, and we'll disagree on that. Not that we shouldn't talk about it, but we'll disagree on it. But I do think that we can perhaps agree on other questions, like I would hope certainly that as few women as possible are in a situation where they have to consider abortion. Because it's a difficult question. I don't want to minimize that, even for those of us who believe that life does not begin at conception, and even when we're talking about very early abortions, when there's much more legal agreement within the Jewish tradition about that stage. Still, it's a difficult situation for any woman who has to make that choice, any family that has to make that choice, and so I think that we can come together on questions of how do we protect women's health, how do we create economic opportunities for women and also men, but often there's a particular question around the economic opportunities of women. How do we ensure that families have whatever they need? How do we make sure that we can take care of children after they are born? There's a lot more that we can agree on, even if it will turn out that we're disagreeing on this one issue. But as I said, what I really appreciate about this conversation is that we're coming in through a broader frame because, as you said, very often it's the Facebook, Twitter slogans, which never have convinced anybody of anything, no matter what the issue, and we're just very hyper-focused on the area on which we have strong disagreements.
It's not just the question of dialogue amongst ourselves and among these traditions. There's also, this consistent ethic is what strikes me is also so divisive within each of our communities. I don't know about Judaism, but Katelyn, you're something of an outlier. I'm so glad you're here, but it's, you look at evangelicals, especially white evangelicals, there's no doubt about it, and how does a consistent ethic, is it getting any traction in that community, in your community? And,
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that probably a younger set of evangelicals would define themselves as pro-life on the issue of abortion, but also recognize that the social issues that the church is called to engage have to expand beyond that. And I think I think a lot of young evangelicals see the effects of leaders in the faith a generation before aligning themselves too strongly or too closely with party ideology and not wanting to, really mourning the effects of that we saw in the 2016 election and being quite frustrated. So I think there is a desire for more consistency, but definitely when you start talking about a consistent life ethic, in many evangelical circles, that sounds like you are giving up on the expediency with which we ought to be pro-life on the topic of abortion. And if we don't continue to fight this fight, what will happen? And it's perceived as a sort of watering down or creating moral equivalence between issues that are quite different. And in fact, I can openly disagree with Christianity Today because they were my employer for 10 years. One of the editors who I greatly respect and agree with on most everything wrote an editorial just a couple years ago kind of defending the choice to prioritize abortion over other issues and taking to task a more consistent life ethic approach. And to me, personally, the reason I think the consistent approach is so important is in part because I want the church to have an effective moral witness. And I do think that when people outside the church see a relative silence among evangelicals when we're talking about family separation at the border, when we're talking about the number of innocent people who are killed via capital punishment every year, and gun violence and how that affects young people in this country, I think some of those charges of hypocrisy are really right on, and I don't want us to be hypocrites. I want us to be consistent in what we believe. So,
Herb, I have to say, I've got the numbers here. Numbers don't lie. And within your community, as it were, atheists, the latest Pew Research Center on American views on abortion, Unitarians say, 90% of Unitarians say it should be legal. Atheists are right after them at 87%. Again, you're something of an outlier, too, within your community. How do you deal with that? Does this get any traction within the atheist, secular community? Obviously, increasing numbers of young people are not affiliated religiously, even if they have a quote-unquote spiritual orientation.
Yeah, for sure. I think that...
Could you pull the...
I think that as you mentioned, as young people are becoming less and less aligned with, an official religion, we're seeing them not really lose their pro-life ethic. Millennials still identify as pro-life in pretty strong numbers, even though they sort of drift away from mainstream religion. In terms of talking about the issue with atheists, I think that from what I've seen from both atheist pro-lifers, but also religious pro-lifers, is that we're sort of realizing that we need to have non-religious arguments for abortion, for why abortion should be considered either immoral or should be illegal. And that's because increasingly we see Christians, Catholics even, having the position that, well, yes, I may believe abortion is morally wrong, or my church teaches that. However, we live in a secular society, and it should be based off of, our laws should be based off of science and logic and reason. And I think that's an excellent argument, and I think that is a horrible reason to be pro-choice, because science and logic and reason, in my opinion, with the research I have done, seems to point to the pro-life position. And I think that talking about abortion from the secular perspective, whether you're talking to someone who may be an atheist, or someone who may be a fundamentalist Christian, or someone who may be a Christian who, doesn't think that their faith should define the laws, we can all go back to the science of embryology, that whether or not we want to say that life begins at conception or birth or somewhere in the middle, we're really talking more about a philosophical concept of personhood, because we know that biologically speaking, life in that new human organism that is genetically distinct, whole and living, does come into creation or come into existence at the moment of sperm-egg fusion during fertilization. So we talk about this kind of concept of life beginning at conception being, a Christian or Catholic dogma, when it's really just scientific dogma. It's found in every embryology textbook. And I think that increasingly the mainstream pro-life movement is realizing this. We're kind of shying away from pray to end abortion, and the theme of the March for Life this year is, I think it's pro-life is pro-science, unique from day one. And I think that's showing that we're realizing that, we can work with secularists and atheists and humanists to meet this common goal, because it's not purely a religious position. It's, a human rights position to be against abortion.
Those scientists and secularists, and they're going to bridle, they're going to bristle at the idea of an anti-abortion message, which is the way they're going to see it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's why it's so important to talk about the philosophy of it, because every scientist can agree that a human being, a human organism, comes into existence at the moment of what is it, conception or fertilization. I don't like conception because people always tell me it sounds religious, so I try to say fertilization. But so the question then becomes not when does human life begin, but which human beings or human organisms deserve human rights. And I think that's a more winning argument for the pro-life side, to position ourselves as a progressive movement for human rights, and not, as we're seeing now, a regressive movement against women's rights.
But can this, in a realistic way, and Bernardin was very clear, he's a very practical man. He wasn't talking up here at 30,000 feet. He was talking about finding, through dialogue, finding a pragmatic way to move forward to inform our body politic. He said, in fact, politically, he said, quote, "A consistent ethic of life must be held by a constituency to be effective." Is there any constituency for this view? Jerry, start with you.
Any constituency?
For the consistent ethic of life, yeah.
I think one of the fascinating things about tonight is that we have people with very different traditions who are struggling with very much the same questions, and how we live as moral beings in a society, upholding certain dimensions of life that have to always be respected. And I think that, for example, the Bishops' Conference just put out a document on racism. And I think this is still so endemic to our society today, and something we have to struggle with. No one likes to believe that they are prejudiced. No one likes to believe that they look down on other individuals, or that other individuals aren't their equal. But it is the reality. I mean, we see it very vividly in our day, where somehow your success is at my demise. And therefore, I have to fight the fact that you're going to be treated equally as I'm being treated, because somehow I'm going to be robbed of something that I want to hold on to. So I think that it's a very important and deep question for our society today. How do we see moral living? And what does it mean to live one's life well and wisely? And we're going to keep struggling with that. But the important thing is that, at least in these communities here, we hear people talking about it, struggling with the evangelical church, with our Jewish community, with atheists. Some would be shocked to think that an atheist might uphold a consistent ethic of life, or that abortion is not to happen. So I think these are very endemic questions in our society that we need to be talking about and we need to be engaging about. The problem is, I think what Bernadine faced and what Francis is facing and what our society is facing is this deep polarization that exists that keeps us from really respecting one another and engaging one another in a real helpful dialogue.
Gerald, do you see is it a viable political vehicle, this idea of talking about ethics across the range?
I do think it is. As I said, it doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything, but opening up the conversation to say, well, what kind of a society do we want to create? How do we want to preserve the dignity of every human being? We're going to have disagreements within that. And abortion is the most obvious, but there will be others. But even starting with that beginning position of we want to create a just society would already be radical if we're in that conversation.
Has the emergence of climate change, when Bernadine gave his talk in 1983, we were facing nuclear winter, potentially. Now we're facing global warming, which is an existential threat to all life on the planet. It's the most consistent threat to life that you can imagine, whether some believe it or not. Is this something that could serve as some kind of vehicle, some kind of spur? Do you get any sense of that, Katelyn, or in your community?
I think if you connect it to, rightly or wrongly, if you can connect issues of environmental degradation to the degradation of communities, poor communities around the world and developing countries, and show clearly the ways that those communities are suffering because of the effects of our abuse of the environment and of creation, I think that is a better inroad than talking about bird migration, or something that I think for evangelicals feels too disconnected from everyday human life, or unfortunately, I think because of certain interpretations of Scripture, a lot of evangelicals do take a theology of dominion and work from a very hierarchical relationship between people and the earth, people and creation. And then you just have kind of a suspicion, a general suspicion toward the findings of scientists, what the scientific community confirms. But I do think if you can connect environmental harm to personal harm, communal harm, which is, you don't have to stretch to do that. I mean, that is clearly shown all over the world. I think you have a better chance of engaging evangelicals on creation care.
I want to open it up to some questions. Let's just raise some hands. And hey, Matt, yes.
So following up on the point about creation, David had mentioned at the very outset that Bishop Kicanas follows a vegetarian diet. Mentioned that we could potentially get into some conversation about how that fits into
That's a real third rail issue, vegan or vegetarian, right? Yeah, exactly.
So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on a little bit more about this connection between a consistent life ethic and non-human animals. Because I know we've talked a little bit about creation, but it seems like throughout this discussion we've mostly been focusing on the idea of human life as being equal. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where other creatures fit into that.
Yeah, let me just repeat that for those who might not have heard. Matt was asking about, again, and honestly it is an issue. Bishop, you're vegetarian? And Jill, you vegetarian too? And vegan? Katelyn, I hope you eat meat.
You need diversity.
Coming from Chicago? Oh, okay. Good, then we've got some difference. But honestly, it is in a serious way, how does this play out? Because there are so many related issues to respect for non-human life.
I can respond to that because I think I have a sort of rare position for a vegan in that my veganism, originally vegetarianism, now veganism, was not inspired by animal rights. It makes me sad to think about factory farming, but it is not my main reason for veganism. It is the environmental effects of animal agriculture on the environment, and it's really a roundabout human rights point of view to be vegan for me, because I know that. And I didn't bring the facts with me because I didn't plan a vegan talk tonight, but we do know that animal agriculture is one of the leading causes of climate change, and climate change is going to be affecting, communities in the global south, communities that do not look like me and are much less privileged than me, and I feel like I do not want to participate in the overconsumption that animal agriculture sort of inherently is within the United States at this point of time. So that's why I'm vegan. I'm totally down to talk about why we should include animals within the consistent life ethic for moral reasons. I think that's a fun topic, but that's not why I am a vegetarian.
Jill, why are you?
Sure. Well, in Judaism, there is a clear difference between human beings and animals, that animals are not created in the image of God and human beings are. That said, there are also obligations toward animals, particularly around avoiding any kind of cruelty to animals. And at least in the biblical narrative, human beings are originally vegetarian, and the permission to eat meat is a concession to human beings' animal nature. But then the laws of kashrut, of keeping kosher, come in to restrict what kinds of meat and one can eat and how it's killed, how it's slaughtered, which is very much, I think, and many think that this is a way to draw our attention to what we're eating. So you can't just, if you keep kosher, you can't just randomly be at a party and pick up something that might be meat or might not, and not even think about it, because you have to know what it is. You have to know if it is, if it's kosher. If you do decide to eat meat, then you have to wait a certain amount of time before you eat any dairy. The particular amount depends on what community you come from. There's a number of different traditions, but it's not something that you do without thinking. You're very, very conscious of when you're eating meat. And so the ideal is vegetarianism, but then eating meat is a concession with many rules attached to it, having to do both with making sure that you're not overly cruel to animals, and then also restrictions that also have the effect of perhaps restricting how much meat one eats, because if you want to have ice cream later, for example, you're not going to just pick up some little bit of meat right now.
Jerry, you.
I was at lunch with Chris earlier today at a vegan restaurant. By the way, if you want to go to a nice vegetarian restaurant, it's at 44 East 19th Street. I don't know the name of it, but anyway, it was very good.
What is it? ABCV. Oh, ABC Vegetarian, yes, yeah. Product placement here. Okay.
But I think what Katelyn said earlier in her presentation about man is not in a dominating role in creation. I think that's what Pope Francis was trying to emphasize in Laudato Si, that all life is a gift to be respected and to be treated with respect. And even the fly, which is an annoyance, is to be not smashed out, but regarded. Now I still smash out mosquitoes, but I'm a vegetarian, not really in any way because of any principle. It was more of a health issue. But I do think Pope Francis, in his document, Laudato Si, helps us to see that life is a gift. It's to be regarded, respected, applauded, valued, appreciated, and and it's all of creation. It's not that man is the dominion over all that is and was created. We are in a relationship, and that relationship is one of respect and regard.
Katelyn, you feel bad now?
I'm gonna crawl
Another
under
question
the table.
down here?
One of the paradoxes nowadays is even the notion of life that is maybe misunderstood. The few friends of mine who had an abortion, basically, they don't have this knowledge that giving life is dying to oneself. So how do you talk about life when it's actually dying to oneself?
How do you talk about life when it's dying to oneself?
I'm not sure I understood that phrase.
I'm sorry, she was talking about, yes, I apologize. She was talking about the notion of abortion, in particular in the framework of abortion, and how do we understand the ideas that giving life means dying to oneself, that even as and I think that could relate to a variety of issues in the sense that any time we're not doing something that gives life, we're sacrificing something of ourselves.
I respect greatly, once said there are several things we have to remember. God loves us, God loves me, and love is always a sacrifice. It always costs. We see that in caregivers, we see that in anyone who is trying to be there for another. And I think, yes, anytime we are going to live our life well, it's going to cost. Because it's not about me. Ranier says life is not about climbing a ladder to get to the top to receive power, prestige, and privilege. Life is about loving and learning to love, and love is a sacrifice always.
Tom Gallagher?
How does the consistent ethic of life get applied to the issue of war? In other words, does the consistent ethic of life trump the just war theory?
How does the consistent ethic of life apply to the just war doctrine? And that's a great question. It struck me when I reread Bernardin's original speech, which was really in the shadow of war and following the bishop's pastoral letter on war. I almost thought to myself, how does this not inevitably lead to some kind of pacifism?
Yeah, I think that within the consistent life ethic, within supporters of it, there is a lot of disagreement on this issue. I know that me personally, when it comes to war, I am a pacifist, but my organization takes the stance that we will take anyone from just war theory to pacifist. I think that there's room to talk about it as long as we really look at just war theory I think in a critical way, because I think that, and I know I'm a pacifist, so I am going to be ultra critical of just war theory, but that it can be used to sort of justify all wars, and that we really need to question if, with our current technology, against any aggressor, can the United States engage in a just war? And I think that's a question that, as a society, we need to really, really look at if we're going to embrace just war theory.
Anybody want to, please?
Well, I'm not going to try to figure out how it fits in. I'll let the Catholics figure out how war fits into consistent ethic of life. But I do come from a tradition that's not pacifist, but that has a lot of conversation about when you're allowed to go to war, how you're allowed to go to war, how you protect the lives of civilians. So it is in that world of just war dialogue that is a whole other study and dialogue, which we won't get into. But I'll leave it to you to talk about how it fits into the general framework.
I mean, when you see things like the Rwanda genocide, or you see what's going on in Rwanda, where do we have to stand in huge injustice that takes place? And obviously, that's a challenge in terms of the consistent ethic. I don't think the consistent ethic is simply saying that anything goes, that I can do whatever to another and no one's going to stand up against it. The question is, how do we stand up against it? And where is some action on our part, or on anyone's part, to protect the lives of others? Where does that begin and where does it end? And I think it's a tough question, and one we have to keep looking at. I know when we entered Iraq, our Holy Father strongly opposed that and sent Cardinal Laghi to beg the president not to engage in this action. Now, he felt he was justified, the president, in going in. Now, we look back and probably it was not a good idea, obviously, a tragic idea, and it's left the country decimated. So I think it's a continual discernment. We need the wisdom of Solomon to know where and when and how to respond to huge aggression that is taking innocent life.
In his 1983 speech, Cardinal Bernardin said, and I quote, "In the public policy exchange, substance and style are closely related. The issues of war, abortion, and capital punishment, among many, are emotional and often divisive questions. As we seek to shape and share the vision of a consistent ethic of life, I suggest a style governed by the following rule. We should maintain and clearly articulate our religious convictions, but also maintain our civil courtesy. We should be vigorous in stating a case and attentive in hearing another's case. We should test everyone's logic, but not question his or her motives." That really stood out to me as I reread the speech, especially at this time in our communities and in our national life. And I really want to thank our panel. I hope you'll join me in thanking them for demonstrating that kind of civil courtesy.